Would you stand with me just for a moment? I want to read our passage this morning. We're going through the book of Romans, and we're going to start in verse 8 this morning in chapter 1. And if we get the air down, someone back there, last week it got really hot in here, and I'm afraid that it will do that again. We need to get ahead of the curve a little bit. I'm going to read in chapter 1 of Romans, verses 8 through 15. And I'm going to cover part of that this morning and part of it next week on the issue of impact and the chance that we have to look at the Apostle Paul and the impact that he wanted to have, the things that he did to impact the church in Rome. Verse 8, "First, I thank my God through Jesus Christ for all of you, because your faith is being proclaimed in all the world. For God is my witness, whom I serve with my spirit in the gospel of His Son, that without ceasing I mention you always in my prayers, asking that somehow by God's will I may now at last succeed in coming to you. For I long to see you, that I may impart to you some spiritual gift to strengthen you. That is, that we may be mutually encouraged by each other's faith, by yours and mine. I want you to know, brothers, that I have often intended to come to you, but thus far have been prevented, in order that I may reap some harvest among you as well as among the rest of the Gentiles. I am under obligation both to the Greeks and to the barbarians, both to the wise and the foolish. And so I am eager to preach the gospel to you also who are in Rome." Thank you. You may be seated. Well, this is a new quarter, and we have a new book for our book club, and it's not in yet because I ordered it and they haven't come in yet. But it is on the back of your outline. It is a book called Jim Elliot, One Great Purpose. And you can get it on Amazon. There will be copies of the book, I'm hoping next Sunday, but we've got all quarter to read it. Jim Elliot was a missionary in Ecuador, and he was reaching out to the Auca Indians there, and it's a story of his missionary heart for people, his desire to impact the lives of others that haven't heard about Jesus Christ, and the life that he lived and the death that he gave, because he knew that life was more than about himself and what he was doing in his own life. And it's just an incredibly encouraging story that I will encourage you to read this quarter. This week and next week, as I said, is all about impact. And let me ask you a question. Whose lives are you impacting right now? Whose lives are you impacting? If you're a follower of Jesus Christ, you, as you'll see, have a calling on your life. And periodically, I think it's good to ask the question, who are the people around me, whether it's my husband or wife, whether it's my children, whether it's my neighbors or people at work, who are the people that God is using me in their lives to impact them? And that's what really our church is all about, as we focus on these few areas of discipleship and evangelism and getting in the Word. That we understand this Great Commission, this idea that God, Jesus Christ, has sent us into the world to have an impact, however that may be, in whatever way it may be, and how significant that is. I received an email from Matt Peden this past week. Anybody remember Matt Peden? Right, he was a pilot in the Navy that was here for 2 years or something. And he went through the Men of Action program that I'm now going through with 4 guys in. And he sent me an email and said, you know what, we've got plugged into a church and I'm discipling a guy, and he asked me to send him the lessons from Men of Action because he wanted to use it in this guy's life. And I thought, how that excites me as a pastor in a church to have not just Matt and Anna that are gone now, and the fact that we have to train people and encourage people, but for so many of you that you are thinking about this issue of how it is that we can impact people for eternity. We've been looking at this book, and as I said, these verses that I read are a picture of Paul and how he wanted to impact the church in Rome. But just by way of introduction, we looked at verse 1 where Paul introduces himself and explains that he is an an apostle, one who's sent. He's set apart for the gospel. He writes in verses 2 and 3 about the book, what this book of Romans is about, the gospel of Jesus Christ. Not only the gospel of Jesus Christ, but also the implications, what this gospel should mean in the life of a believer and follower of Jesus Christ. The impact that it should have. As he said in those first verses, his goal is to bring about, the gospel's goal is to bring about the obedience for the sake of his name among all the nations. That is, that we understand that as followers of Jesus Christ, when you come to a place of seeing your sin and turning from your sin to Jesus Christ, when you believe that he has done all that's needed in order to earn your salvation, and that you're free from your sins because of what Jesus Christ did, he now calls you to be involved in promoting his renown. I used that word before, his name. And exalting his name. Not just in our singing here on Sunday, but in our lives. In the way that we respond to people, in the way that we treat people, in the things that we talk about as Christians, to the praise of his name. And then we learned in verse 6 to 7 a few weeks ago this idea of who Paul was writing to. He says there that he's writing to those who belong to Jesus Christ. He's writing to Christians. That's important because as you go through any book, as you read any letter, you have to ask the question, who was it written to? Because that's very important to understand as far as getting the context of what Paul was writing to and what he was trying to deal with this. Now, in this section, we're looking at the method that Paul used of how it is that he was able to impact the believers in his ministry that he had. Why is it that Paul wrote this letter? Why is it that Paul gave his life for the ministry? Why did he give so much time and energy and so much sacrifice for these things? And by way of implication, for us to ask as believers today, to ask ourselves, why is it that we would spend so much time in ministry? And not just ministry of the church in these walls that we have, but ministry at work, ministry in our neighborhood, in any area that God puts us, to begin to ask ourselves the question, why is it that we would dedicate so much time to doing these things for the cause of the gospel? And the answer ultimately is to impact lives for the gospel, to make a difference. That's what Jim Elliot thought about, I believe, when I read his biography, this heart that he had, that he knew that he had to go beyond his own comfort zone to places where people had not heard about Jesus Christ and the church that needed to be built up. And as we walk through this passage, there are two reasons why Paul wanted to impact lives. Two reasons. The first reason we looked at it when we looked at this description of who Paul was is that he was called to do this. He was called to impact lives. God had saved Paul, and therefore God had a calling on Paul's life to do certain things as an apostle, as a missionary. It says he was called as an apostle, set apart for the gospel of God. Really, all the way through this letter and all the way through the letters that you see this calling that God had on the apostle Paul to be involved in ministry as an apostle. He was bought with a price. He was a child of his heavenly Father. And the same thing is true. I was called recently to jury duty, and when you're called to jury duty, you respond to the call, right? Right? If you don't respond to the call, then you're in deep trouble, right? Somebody's going to call you on the phone, or you're going to have a warrant for your arrest, right? And so when I had jury duty, I called in, and because I had to get a postponement of part of it. I wanted to make sure that I had fulfilled the calling that I had on for that whole month to be faithful to do that. And you realize as a follower of Jesus Christ, just like Paul, that we have a calling in our life. There are things that God calls us to do. He says in verse 14, we'll study it next week, he says, I am under obligation both to the Greeks and to the barbarians, both to the wise and the foolish. Paul saw that obligation that he had to bring honor to Christ's name. And realize that his life, as we need to understand, our lives are not just about ourselves, but about a bigger picture, something that God wants us to do. I'm reading that book by Paul David Tripp. And in the book, I'm going to read a quote from him. He writes, we too live in the middle of our own mini drama. Have you been living in a mini drama this week? I've been living in a mini drama this week. And he says, but you too are just one chapter in the world's most significant story. You are most lost, get this, you are most lost when you cannot see beyond your own personal drama. Let me read that again. You are most lost when you cannot see beyond your own personal drama. Because the details of your little story do not provide enough information, enough reason, and wisdom to help you make sense of what it really is and what God really wants to do. He says the purpose of the Bible is to help us get to know the one, that's God, who is always on the center stage so that we can live with a God-oriented mentality, deciding and acting in ways that fit within the plot of His story, and I'll add what He wants to accomplish. The Bible wasn't given to solve all of your problems. Only eternity will do that. Remember last week we talked about the hope that we have, the resurrection? The Bible was given so that God, the God of the plot, would be the God of your heart, and you would live with a deep and personal commitment to the success of His story, of His reputation, of His renown. That's the idea. We're living here for His story, for His glory, for His purposes. And that's what Paul saw. That's what he said in this passage I read. And that's what we'll see in this book of Romans, that Paul's life was not just about himself, but he had a calling on his life. We only find our true meaning in life. We only find direction. We only find peace in our lives when our orientation goes away from ourselves onto that obligation, as Paul said, that calling that God has on our lives. And I'll guarantee you, because I see it in my life, that whenever I turn my eyes away from God's calling on my life and the orientation that I should have, and I begin to put it on my situation and what I'm going through, my vision gets cloudy. And I begin to struggle in my life. But there's a second reason why Paul wants to impact lives. As well as a sense of calling and obligation, there is a concern and a love that he has for people. You see this in this passage in the book of Romans. For the Christians in Rome, he has a deep desire to impact their lives, not just because God had called him to do that, but because of his genuine love and concern for them. That's what you see in the passage. Paul hasn't even met them yet. He hasn't even been to Rome yet, and yet he's writing this letter out of concern to help them to understand the gospel and understand the implications of the gospel. He has a fatherly concern. This is what you see here. He says in verse 11 that he longs to see them. Again, he hasn't met them, and yet he has his heart, as a father does, and a compassion. Paul's motivation for ministry is a sense of love for them. This is the second greatest commandment, right? We're supposed to love God with all of our heart, soul, mind, and our strength. And then we're supposed to love others in the way that we love ourselves. Paul is living that out and encouraging us by his example to live that out. So we see this man, Paul, in this book of Romans, but all the way through the book of Acts, as we see the story of Paul caring, sharing, giving, sacrificing for believers because of his compassion and his desire to impact others. The question I have for you is, do you do things because you have a genuine desire and willingness to help others? When you see somebody at work or in your neighborhood or wherever you are struggling, do you have the Father's compassion on them to respond to that need and care for them? Not just because God calls you to, but because you see the need and you want to meet that need. There is a sense of calling and a depth of love that he has for these Christians. And so it's important for him, and it's important for us to understand this as we get into this passage, about how then we're supposed to impact the people around us. What are the things that we're supposed to do in order to care for them and impact their lives? To have a sincere love for them, to be concerned about them. That's what shepherding is all about. And Ezekiel 34, we talk about that idea of shepherding, and that's the picture that we should have as believers, that we care for the people around us, and we want the best for them in their lives. And both of the reasons should be the heart of ministry. It's the picture of a father. A father has a legal and a moral obligation to care for his children, right? And we see that missing now some days, but we understand that's true, that for those of you who are fathers, in part that you have an expectation by those around you that you're going to care for your children. But as a father, there must be more to it than that. There should be a fatherly love and concern for the welfare of those that you're under. And especially for you that are fathers, that you're spiritual leaders in the home, whatever the age of your children, even if they're adults, begin to ask the question or answer the question, how is it that I'm going to be impacting my children? How is it that I'm going to impact my life, my wife? How is it that I'll impact that person maybe that you're discipling right now? Those people that are in your Bible study, if you're teaching a Sunday school class, whatever ministry you find yourself in at work, how is it that I'm able to impact those lives? And that's what we're looking at this morning. There are 7 things that I'll point out here, 3 this morning and 4 next week. The first one, as you probably have seen, is encouragement in verse 8. Encouragement. Paul, having given this introduction, launches into encouragement for these Christians that are in Rome. He writes in verse 8, first of all, the first thing he wants to do is he says, I thank my God through Jesus Christ for all of you. Let me just stop there. When is the last time that you have said that to your wife, to your kids, to whoever it is? You've stopped and you have said to them, you know what? I am thankful to God for you, for your part in my life, for the things that you have added to my life. He says, first, I thank my God through Jesus Christ for you because your faith is being proclaimed in all the world. What words of encouragement for the Christians in Rome. He starts out by encouraging them for their faith and for the lives that they had lived so far. The question is, how often do you follow Paul's example here, and the first thing that comes out of your mouth is encouragement to someone else? Is that the first thing that you think about when you think about meeting with somebody else? When you go home from work to your wife or your husband, when you first talk to your kids in the morning and you're thinking about all those things that they did last night or all the things that they've done recently, is the first thing that you want to do when you meet with somebody, as Paul does here, is to give them words of encouragement. Do you say something encouraging as Paul did here, or do you say something discouraging? Or do you ask for something? Or do you talk about yourself? Paul is thankful for their lives and their faith. And it says in the verse that he recognized that it was from God. God was the one that had given them faith. And he thanked God for his work. He recognized that it was through Jesus Christ that they were able to have faith, and because of what Christ did on the cross. But he also recognizes their obedience and their faith and the impact of their lives. Do we do the same? We can tend to focus and talk about the faults and the failures of other people rather than the things that they are doing well. The church in Rome was probably in need of some encouragement. The Roman historian Tacitus said, Rome flowed all things vile and abominable. It was not an easy place to live. The immorality and the worship of Caesar and all the things that were entailed in basically a godless society could have easily crept into the Christians that were in Rome and influenced their lives. But in the midst of that culture, in the midst of what they were living with in that culture, they were living for Jesus Christ. And here the apostle begins his letter by noting, commending them, which would have been a boost, I think, to their faith and their encouragement. He encouraged them because they were saints. They were ones that were set apart, living in a system in a time where they probably needed encouragement. Because maybe in some ways like today, it can be very discouraging to live in a culture that is turning away from God. He encouraged them because they were willing to be a beacon of light, and they needed to be reminded of the impact that they were having, not only just on the church that they were a part of, but on the whole known world. Paul uses the word, he talks about the whole world here, probably referring to the whole Roman Empire. Can you imagine that these Christians that were under such duress and difficulty in this vile society had such a testimony that their testimony, the way that they lived their lives, was going out and it was reverberating throughout the whole Roman world. The word here, proclaim, means to spread good news abroad with celebration and commending. It's the idea of announcing something and telling others of something that was done great. And Paul comes back to them now in this letter, and in the midst of all that they're struggling with, to give them this boost and this encouragement in their Christian lives. Do you know somebody who's struggling right now in their faith? Are you willing to come aside them as Paul does here and to encourage them? The church had a reputation, not because of its pastor, not because of its buildings, not because of the number of people that attended the church, but because of their faith and the way that they were living. And they were encouraged for it. And these words of encouragement were both, as I said before, an obligation, but it was also something that Paul did out of a love for them. It says in 1 Thessalonians 5:11, it reads, encourage one another and build one another up, just as you are doing. There's sometimes in our life when maybe we don't feel it, but we need to make the choice because we know there's an obligation that I'm in a situation, in a relationship, where maybe it's tense or difficult, but God calls me to encourage this other person and to build them up. That's what the verse says. In Hebrews chapter 10, verse 24 and 25, the author there says, let us consider how to stir one another up to love and good deeds, not neglecting meeting together as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. See, what the author there is saying is there's such a tendency for us today as believers to get fragmented and segmented and to not be together. But it's only when we're together that we can encourage each other and we can be encouraged by each other. And so we need to have a habit in our lives as believers of being together. That's why Paul had this burden to be with these believers in Rome to encourage them. We are called, regardless of what we're going through, how our day is going, to encourage others, even when we don't feel like it. We don't do things because we feel like them, right? Right? We do them because God calls us to do those things. That's what obedience is. The Romans were in a difficult place, and Paul starts out by putting that in perspective, encouraging them. But he also did it out of love. He did it because he knew the things that we were going through, and out of his love and compassion, he said, I need to build these people up. He saw what they were dealing with in their culture. We'll talk about that later in chapter 1. We need to have a love for others that we are willing to come alongside them and build them up and encourage them. How significant can words of encouragement be in a time of struggle? Have you ever been in a place where you've been struggling spiritually or struggling in any way, and somebody came alongside you and encouraged you? What an impact that can have on our lives. A timely word of encouragement can be powerful. It can lift up, it can strengthen, it can help someone to press on in their faith. Proverbs 25 verse 11 reads, a word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in a setting of silver. I'm not sure all what that means, but it talks about the fact that a word fitly spoken, that is a word strategically placed, a word that you place in somebody's heart and life at the right time is like beautiful jewelry. Or Proverbs 18:21, one I often use in counseling. It talks about death and life are in the power of the tongue, and those who love it will eat its fruits. Death and life are in the power of the tongue. You have the ability, I have the ability to encourage others, to lift them up, to give them, in a sense, life, to encourage them. You and I need to think more about the words that we say, to recognize that God is doing something in other people's lives, and to verbally recognize that and encourage people. It doesn't mean that we never say anything negative. It doesn't mean that we never have to confront in a loving way, but is that all we say? Is our speech seasoned with salt? Is there, in a sense, I think it has the Old Testament honey on our lips? I would encourage you, before you go home from work, before you see your spouse, before you have time with your kids, before you have that conversation with your coworker, that you stop and you begin to pray and say, God, help me to follow the example of Paul, that my words would be encouraging and building up. Number 2 in your outline is prayer. Not only did Paul start with encouraging, recognizing what the church in Rome, the Christians there were doing, but he also prayed. Verse 9. He says, "For God is my witness, whom I serve with my spirit in the gospel of His Son, that without ceasing I mention you always in my prayer at all times." Paul, even though he had never been there, he had heard about them. I'm sure he had heard about the things that they were going through. He knew about the culture, lifted up these Roman Christians in prayer. This was part of his ministry. Paul was somebody who knew and understand that the most powerful thing that we can do is pray for somebody else as we minister to them. He says their God is my witness. They hadn't seen Paul pray. He hadn't put it on display, but he had consistently prayed for them, and he wanted them to know that he had prayed for them. Paul wasn't showy. He probably did what Jesus talked about in the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus said there, "But when you go and pray, go to your room and shut the door and pray to your Father who is in secret." I remember seeing that movie about prayer. It was, what was the name of it? War Room, right? I remember watching that movie and saying, "Oh, I need to go home and I need to have a prayer room," right? And though I pray, I haven't gotten to that place yet, and I need to. It's a picture of the impact of one life on another, not just by what you say, but by your prayers. And that's what's so deceiving at times, because prayer is often the very thing that we maybe don't want to do. It's the hardest thing that we can do, but it's the most important thing that we can do. And Paul says here, "I constantly remember you in my prayers at all times." These Roman Christians were on Paul's prayer list. Do you have a prayer list? Do you have a list of people and situations and things that you were praying about? I can't even imagine the Apostle Paul going to all these churches and knowing all these people and taking the time that he had to take, because he said that he prayed for those believers. 1 Thessalonians 5:17 gives us that obligation to pray. Paul there says, pray continually. That is, Paul had the sense and understanding that it was out of love, but it was also out of obligation that he had to commit himself to pray for the church in Rome. Samuel, near his death, in 1 Samuel 12, said, "As for me, far be it from me that I should sin against the Lord by failing to pray." For the prophet Samuel, he looked at prayer as an obligation that if he didn't fulfill the calling to pray, he saw it as a sin against them and against the Lord. So he prayed. My question for you is, do you follow Paul and Samuel's example to pray? Are you praying for those under your care? Are you praying for your wife? Are you praying for your husband? Are you praying for your children? Are you praying for the students in Sunday school or youth group, the ones that you minister to, the man or the woman that you're discipling? So the question is, what does it mean to pray without ceasing? He says at all times, to pray continually. I read that verse. Well, I think it means that prayer should be a natural part of our everyday life and thoughts. That as we're going through our day, that we're not just thinking about things, but naturally taking them to the Lord in prayer. Let me ask you a question. How much time do you spend thinking about an issue or a concern? And then how much time do you spend actually praying about it? I find that a lot of times in my thought life, in my daily life, that I spend a lot more time thinking about things than I do praying about them. You realize that thinking about things, in a way, is kind of talking to yourself, right? Now, how much are you able to do about the situation that is concerning you, or the person that's struggling, or things that are going on in their life? Well, you can do a little bit. You can encourage them. But how much can you do compared to how much can God do in the situation? God is able to change the heart. We looked at that last Sunday. God is the God of the resurrection. No matter what's going on in your life or the person's life, if you believe that God can forgive us of our sins and cleanse us, if you believe that there's a bodily resurrection someday, that God can do anything, that God created everything out of nothing, that isn't it logical that we should spend more time talking to God than talking to ourselves? And yet often it's not the thing that we do. So my encouragement for you is as you go through your day, there are things I think at times that the Holy Spirit will bring to your mind or your memory will bring to your mind. And you will have a tendency to think about those things and think about those things and think about those things. And my encouragement to you is to change that habit. And instead of talking to yourself about those things, talk to God about those things. And lift them up to the Lord. And that's what I think it means. I think it means that when you go through your day and automatically a concern or an issue or somebody comes to your mind that you know is going through something, that the immediate reaction for you is not to think about it, but immediately take it up to the Lord and say, God, I'm going to lift this up to you right now. Whatever you're doing, you can send those little prayers up there. That's what I think it means by praying without ceasing. Not that you don't have your own time, as Jesus said, in your prayer closet or in your prayer room, but all through the day that you were lifting these requests before God, repeatedly before your Father who is able to answer those prayers. Now the question is, what did he pray about? What did Paul pray about if we think that he is an example that we should follow? Well, he notes one thing in a moment that we'll look at, but I would suggest that predominantly Paul's prayers were about people's spiritual condition and growth. Their spiritual condition and growth. It doesn't mean at all, obviously, that we shouldn't pray for people's physical concerns. We need to pray for Fred this week and he found out that he has a mass in his chest that's about the size of an apple, and he's having tests right now to try to find out what's going on. We need to pray for him. We don't need to neglect that. But we also need to pray, and I think primarily pray for people's spiritual condition and their needs. We tend to focus on the things that matter some but don't matter the most. How much time do you spend praying for those that you love about their spiritual heart and their lives? The things not that they're going through in work, but their spiritual struggles and the way that they need to grow. And the things that God maybe wants to do in their lives. Ephesians chapter 3, Paul prays a prayer. He says, "For this reason I kneel before the Father, from whom every family in heaven and on earth derives its name. And I pray that out of his glorious riches he may strengthen you with power through his Spirit in your inner being." That is something to pray. You ever prayed that for your husband or your wife, for your kids? That God would strengthen them with power through his Spirit in their inner being, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith. He says, I pray that you, being rooted and established in love, may have power, together with all the Lord's holy people, to grasp how wide and long and how deep, high and deep is the love of Christ. How often do you pray that for somebody? God, I'm praying that this person would know the love of Christ that goes beyond understanding. See, that no matter what's going on in their physical lives and their job and the stresses that they have going through, that if they know the love of Christ, if they know the power of the resurrection, if they know these things, that God, even in the midst of those things, can help them. Philippians chapter 1, Paul there says, "For this reason I kneel before the Father, from whom every family in heaven and on earth derives its name. I pray that out of his glorious riches he may strengthen you with power through his Spirit in your inner being, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith. And I pray that you, being rooted and established in love, may have power," same theme, "together with all God's holy people." God is powerful. God is powerful to work in our lives when we commit ourselves to prayer. So Paul prayed out of a sense of obligation, but also out of a sense of love, a genuine concern for them. This is seen all the way through this passage. I pray that now at last, by God's will, the way may be open for me to come to you. His prayer was flavored with a longing to see them, a longing to engage them, to be with them. So what it means for us is that putting aside, if we have that love for my husband, that's a whole other story. I don't have a husband, okay? If I have that love for my wife, if I have that love for my kids, if I have that love for you in this church, in the fellowship, if I have love for my family that is in need, it drives me to pray. It is so easy to skip prayer. It is so easy to postpone prayer. It is so easy to not pray. But our love for others must drive us to pray for them. Ian Bound said, prayer is the easiest and the hardest of all things. You realize that it's the easiest and the hardest of all things. It's easy because any time, just in a conversation, just like you would have a conversation with anyone here, God is always there. He is always waiting to talk to you and to hear from you. It's the easiest thing to do. No matter where you are, no matter what you're going through, He is always there. But it's also the hardest of all things. He says it's the simplest and the sublimest, the weakest and the most powerful. Its results lie outside the range of human possibilities. They are limited only by the omnipotence, the all-powerfulness of God. So my question to you by way of application is, do you love that person enough to commit to pray for them, as Paul did for these believers in Rome? Are you willing to commit the time and to constantly remember those people in your prayers? We're going to end because I'm out of time and we have communion. But I want to give you one more application. This coming Tuesday is a church who set aside a day of prayer. And I want to ask you this week, as we've done before, that you would think about taking an hour out of that day. You can pick whatever hour you want, 6 in the morning, 10 at night, 2 in the afternoon, whatever it is. If you're able to pray in the middle of the day, pick those times, because a lot of people work and they can't do it during the middle of the day. But I want to ask you to take an hour this Tuesday, and you sign up in the lobby. My lovely wife will be out there. And you commit to pray for an hour. You don't need to come here. You pray at your home. You pray wherever you want to pray, but you just commit to pray for that hour. There's a sheet out there of things that you can pray for. What it means, I think, as followers of Christ, if we're going to follow Paul's example, to be devoted to prayer. There's so many burdens, not just physical, but especially spiritual, in people's lives that we need to lift up for each other. And we're going to have communion now. I'm going to ask Ron to come up and lead us in that.